young woman's dreams are shattered when a powerful figure publicly humiliates her, making her feel unworthy of the success she's worked so hard for. But what happens when she refuses to let that moment define her? Before we dive into this compelling story of resilience and redemption, let us know in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated, only to prove everyone wrong? Brielle Carter had spent her entire life proving people wrong. She had been the first in her family to attend college, the one who stayed up late into the night studying while working 2 part-time jobs just to afford tuition. She had done everything right, maintained a near-perfect GPA, led student organizations, and even landed an internship at a prestigious law firm. And yet here she was, standing in front of Dean Richard Calloway, a man who barely glanced at her before making a decision that could alter her future forever. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter," Calloway said, his voice dripping with condescension as he adjusted his expensive cufflinks. "We simply don't have a spot available for you in this mentorship program. We prioritize students with more potential." Brielle's stomach twisted. "Potential?" she repeated, her voice tight. Calloway sighed as if she were wasting his time. "You understand, don't you? The students selected for this program are those who truly stand out, those who fit the image of what Kensington University represents." Brielle knew what that meant. She had seen the list of students chosen. Almost all of them came from wealthy families, their parents donating generously to the university. And not one of them looked like her. Her chest burned, not just with embarrassment, but with rage. She had earned her place. She had worked twice as hard, excelled beyond expectation. "Sir, my academic record speaks for itself," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. "I've been on the dean's list every semester. I've received the highest marks in my pre-law courses. My professors—" "Ms. Carter," Calloway interrupted, finally looking up from his paperwork, his piercing blue eyes settling on her with something close to amusement. "You're quite ambitious. But this program isn't just about academics. It's about grooming future leaders, people who will represent this institution with dignity, poise, and stature." She caught the slight pause before that last word. Her skin, her background, her entire existence. It wasn't what Kensington University wanted to parade around in front of its donors and board members. Brielle's hands clenched at her sides. "With all due respect, sir, I am a future leader." Calloway exhaled through his nose, shaking his head as if she were a child who just didn't understand the way the world worked. "Confidence is admirable, but let's be realistic. This isn't the right place for you." The words cut deeper than she expected. This wasn't the right place for her. Not because she wasn't qualified, not because she hadn't earned it, but because someone like her, someone who came from a struggling single-parent home, someone who had to fight for every opportunity, someone who refused to fit into the neat little box of privilege, wasn't what they wanted. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Every fiber of her being told her to push back harder, to demand answers, to force him to see her worth. But she knew better. This was a battle she wouldn't win. Not today. Straightening her shoulders, Brielle swallowed the lump in her throat. "Thank you for your time, Dean Calloway," she said, her voice even. She turned before he could dismiss her, walking out of his office with her head held high. But the moment she stepped into the empty hallway, the weight of the moment crushed down on her. Her breath came faster. The lump in her throat threatened to break free. She refused to let it. Instead, she inhaled sharply and walked past the mahogany walls lined with portraits of past university presidents, past the display cases showcasing awards given to alumni who looked nothing like her. She walked past students who would never know what it felt like to be told they didn't belong, not because they lacked talent, but because of something they could never change. By the time she stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, her hands had stopped shaking. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. She wasn't going to let him define her. She had spent her entire life proving people wrong, and she wasn't about to stop now. Brielle didn't sleep that night. She stared at the ceiling of her small, off-campus apartment, Calloway's words repeating in her mind like a cruel mantra. "This isn't the right place for you." She had heard those words before. In high school, when a counselor suggested she consider a trade instead of college. At her first job, when a manager assumed she wasn't polished enough for a leadership position. Even when she was a child, hearing her mother sigh and say, "Baby, you're going to have to fight twice as hard for half as much." She wasn't new to this feeling, but tonight it burned differently. This time, she wasn't just another girl facing rejection. She had earned her place, and someone with power had deliberately snatched it away. That realization turned the sting into something sharper. By sunrise, she had made up her mind. She was going to make them regret doubting her. The next morning, she threw herself into everything. If the school wouldn't recognize her value, she'd make it impossible to ignore. She doubled down on her academics, making sure she wasn't just excelling, but dominating every class she was in. She wasn't just turning in papers. She was crafting arguments so airtight that even her toughest professors had to pause before grading them. When the campus law journal opened applications for editorial positions, she applied. Not for a staff writer role like most juniors, but for senior editor. The selection panel raised their eyebrows at her audacity. Then they read her submission. By the following week, she was leading meetings, her name printed at the top of every issue. She didn't stop there. She reached out to alumni, sat in on board meetings, networked with faculty members who actually believed in merit. She found out about off-campus internships Calloway's favorite students never bothered to look for. She secured an exclusive summer position at a top law firm before some of her peers even knew the applications were open. She was relentless. People started noticing. Professors began calling on her first in class, curious about her sharp insights. Other students whispered about how she seemed to always be everywhere, at the top of the GPA rankings, in meetings with department heads, being introduced to powerful alumni at networking events. Even Calloway started to look at her differently when she passed him in the halls. At first, his dismissive expression hadn't changed, but then the double-take started. She wasn't invisible anymore. But visibility came with its own challenges. It was no secret that some students, particularly the ones who had been granted opportunities she had been denied, resented her rise. One afternoon, as she entered the student lounge, she heard hushed voices fall silent. A group of her classmates, ones who had been selected for the mentorship program, sat in a corner, their eyes flickering toward her before quickly looking away. She didn't need to hear what they were saying. She already knew. They thought she was trying too hard, that she was pushing too much, standing out too much, making too much noise in a place that wasn't designed for someone like her. She let them whisper. She let them watch. But the moment that nearly broke her came out of nowhere. One evening, after a late-night study session, she found an email in her inbox. It was anonymous. "You really think you belong here? Keep forcing yourself in places you don't, and you might regret it." For a moment, she just stared at it, her hands frozen over the keyboard. The coward didn't even have the guts to put their name on it. For a brief second, she felt the exhaustion creeping in, the overwhelming weight of constantly fighting just to exist in a space she had already earned. Then something inside her shifted. She closed the email, and she kept going. By the time graduation neared, her name was impossible to ignore. She had built relationships with the right people, made an impression in the right rooms. She was walking across that stage with not just a degree, but a job offer from one of the most prestigious law firms in the state. And yet she knew she wasn't done. Only, she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She had to go even further. Because this fight was bigger than just her. The applause filled the grand hall, but Brielle Carter wasn't focused on the sound. She had been in rooms like this before. elegant, full of powerful people who pretended not to notice her until they had no choice. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't just another face in the crowd. Tonight, they had invited her. She adjusted the lapels of her tailored blazer, the weight of the trustee pin glinting under the soft chandelier lights. It was heavier than she expected. Or maybe that was just the weight of the moment, sinking in. Dean Richard Calloway sat just a few seats away from her, his expression unreadable. The last time she had sat across from him in an office, he had told her she didn't belong. Now, they were colleagues. The irony was almost poetic. The university had extended the invitation months ago, a formality wrapped in flowery language about progress and representation. But she knew what it really was. She had become too successful to ignore. After graduating at the top of her class, she had soared through law school, built a name for herself, shattered expectations at every turn. Her career had been marked with relentless ambition and undeniable results. She had represented clients that mattered, made the right connections, became a name that people spoke about in boardrooms. And somewhere along the way, Kensington University had realized they needed her more than she needed them. When they offered her a seat on the board of trustees, she had taken her time to respond, not out of hesitation, but out of strategy. Because if she was going to walk back into this institution, she wasn't coming as the student they had underestimated. She was coming as the woman they now had to respect. The meeting proceeded as expected. Budget approvals, alumni donations, strategic planning for the next 5 years. Brielle listened intently, contributing when necessary, making mental notes of every gap in their so-called commitment to diversity. She could feel Calloway watching her. He had spoken very little during the meeting, only offering input when required, but the way his fingers drummed lightly on the polished oak table, the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly when she spoke, it told her everything she needed to know. He recognized her power now. After the meeting adjourned, she took her time gathering her things, deliberately waiting until the room had mostly emptied. When she finally stood, Calloway was still at his seat, pretending to review notes. She didn't hesitate. "Dean Calloway," she said smoothly, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who belonged. Not because he had allowed it, but because she had earned it. His eyes flickered up to meet hers. "Miss Carter." "Trustee Carter," she corrected, adjusting the pin on her lapel with a slow, deliberate movement. A flicker of something crossed his face, surprise, maybe even respect, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She let the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable before she finally spoke again. "I believe the university has been making some efforts to improve its mentorship programs," she said casually, as if she hadn't spent years proving she never needed their version of mentorship. "I'd love to review the selection criteria." Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's something we can discuss at the next meeting." She smiled, but there was nothing soft about it. "I think we should discuss it now." For the first time, she saw it. The shift. The moment he realized that she was no longer the student standing in his office pleading her case. She wasn't asking for a seat at the table anymore. She was the table, and there wasn't a thing he could do about it. Brielle sat at the head of the long conference table, the weight of the moment pressing against her shoulders, but she didn't let it show. She had fought too hard, pushed too far to hesitate now. The Kensington University Board of Trustees meeting was in full swing, and all eyes were on her. The discussion had shifted to the mentorship program, the very same program she had been denied all those years ago. Now she had the authority to change it. The usual faces filled the room, most of them comfortable in their seats, speaking in rehearsed, measured tones, guarding their words like prized possessions. Calloway, seated directly across from her, had remained mostly silent throughout the meeting. He had once held all the power in these rooms, but today his presence felt smaller than it used to. The mentorship program needs to reflect the actual excellence we claim to uphold, Brielle said, her voice calm, steady. That means removing barriers that have nothing to do with merit. An older trustee, a man who had probably served on this board since before she was born, shifted uncomfortably. "And what barriers are you referring to, exactly?" Brielle didn't blink. "The unspoken ones." A few quiet murmurs rippled across the table, but no one dared to challenge her outright. They all knew. This university had a long history of protecting its traditions that conveniently benefited a certain kind of student while overlooking others. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers interlaced on the table. For years, this program has prioritized students from certain backgrounds, students with access, students who fit a particular image. That ends now. The air in the room shifted. Calloway finally spoke. "We've always selected students who represent the best of Kensington." Brielle met his gaze head-on. "That's not true. We've selected students who represent the most privileged of Kensington." "That's not the same thing." He exhaled slowly, but there was no anger in his expression this time. He was studying her, perhaps seeing her in a way he never had before. "We have donors to consider," another trustee said carefully, "and we can't afford to alienate—" Brielle raised a hand, cutting him off. "Donors invest in results. If we continue limiting opportunity to the same select few, we're failing to produce the strongest graduates this university is capable of. If we want to maintain our reputation, we need to evolve." Silence, the kind that meant she had made her point. She had spent years learning how to navigate these rooms, how to speak in a way that made resistance futile. She knew how to make them listen. The vote to revise the mentorship program passed. It was a victory, but she knew it was just the beginning. After the meeting, as the other board members filed out, Calloway lingered. She wasn't surprised. He took his time, collecting his papers, adjusting his tie before finally looking at her. "You came back." She tilted her head slightly. "Did you think I wouldn't?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips, though it was hard to tell if it was amusement or something else. "No," he admitted. "I knew you would." There it was. The quiet acknowledgement. He wouldn't say the words out loud, but they didn't need to be spoken. He had underestimated her once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. She didn't offer him any reassurance, any soft words to make him feel better about the past. She simply nodded and walked past him, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The halls of Kensington felt different now, not because they had changed, but because she had.